picture of Dale. You don't look too bad, Dale.
There we go. There we go.
Well, finally. Here we are, everybody. It's this is SJ Thomason, and today I'm here with Bob Rucker, who has a master's in nuclear engineering. He spent 38 years in nuclear engineering before he decided to really dig deep into the Shroud of Turin. So when he was a nuclear engineer, he didn't have as much time, but now he has plenty of time. And so today he's going to distill 10 years worth of research on the Shroud of Turin in a way that only a nuclear engineer could do. And so we're very privileged and honored to be here with him. And I'm also joined by my friend Dale of Real Seekers, and I have actually links in the description to both of their channels. So you're going to want to go ahead and subscribe as quickly as you can. And so he is first going to share a little bit of information about that 1989 Nature publication on the Shroud of Turin. And so if you're joining our channel and you think the Shroud is a fake, or you think the carbon dating from 1988 is authentic, think again. We have good evidence to show you that the Shroud of Turin is very likely the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And so with that, I will go over to Dale.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Stephanie. So the last time I was on your show, maybe like a couple weeks ago, and I was a very bad boy because I had promised my friend, our mutual friend, Guy Powell, he's putting together a petition against the carbon-14 dating. He wants to send that petition, get as many signatures, not just from pro-Shroud people, but Shroud skeptics as well, admit that this paper is flawed. So we should get as many signatures, whether you're pro-Shroud or Shroud skeptic. We want you to sign this petition, and I'll have Guy explain that in a little quick 4-minute clip, but what that's about. We're basically trying to get the 1989 Nature paper on the carbon dating of the Shroud retracted, or at the very least amended. And I'll just share my screen just to show you guys what it looks like.
Yeah, because it was, while he's doing that, it was very strange with the British Museum because they didn't release the data from the Shroud of Turin, from the data collection back in 1988 until 2017 when they were forced to. And then other people now have dove into the Shroud evidence and found a lot of flaws in that study. So here we go. Here's Dale's sharing the screen.
All right. So here is the petition itself. So you can see we've got about 300 of the 500 goal that Guy's looking for to retract the paper. So basically you just click the link. I'll put the link in the chat. But just want to play Guy Powell, just a 4-minute quick clip explaining what this petition is about in his own words. So here we go.
But why don't you just tell us a little bit about this this petition that you're trying to get going here, and then what the goal is for this?
Absolutely. So as I've gotten into the to understand it more, there's a handful of pretty big historical events, recent as opposed to over the last 2,000 years. So in as many of you may know, in 1978 there was a pretty big scientific study of the Shroud. And that was called STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project. And they spent 120 hours straight, 5 days, actually being with the Shroud and measuring it and doing all kinds of tests on it. But all of those tests were non-destructive. And as a matter of fact, the whole time, everybody that was close to it were not allowed to actually touch it. They had gloves on. One of the tests, though, that they were not able to do was a radiocarbon dating of it. And that was, at least at the time, believed to be kind of the gold standard in coming up with a date of an archaeological relic, in this case, or an archaeological find. And the idea was, if you would do a test, then you would come up with something around the 1st century, because that's when it's believed that the Shroud, if it's authentic, would have been created.
Sure.
So the radiocarbon testing was done. However, in 1988, they got permission for it, and it was taken out of one of the corners of the Shroud. And unfortunately, it was a bad corner to take. Nevertheless, that's what they did. They took it, and they came up with a date range of 1260 AD to 1390 AD. And of course, that sent shockwaves through the Shroud scientific community, and it really did a lot of damage to Shroud research. But more important, and then as a follow-on to that, and for today, very important, is then the announcement was made, and then in 19 1989. So within a handful of months, in February 16th article of Nature magazine, which was at the time considered the premier scientific publication to get a peer-reviewed study of a peer-reviewed article of your study. Right. And so the Nature magazine went off, and then they had 21 scientists to do the peer review. Now, it was pretty fast because the test was done in October, and so they wanted to get the article out pretty quickly in February 16th. And they came out with that article, and it, and as I said, that whole thing, and then plus this article really sent shockwaves through the Shroud research community. In the meantime, since then, over the last 20 or 30 years, that article and that research has been basically debunked. Mm-hmm. And so what the idea is of the petition is to then have Nature magazine review the new evidence, amend the article, or totally retract it. Now, in an ideal world, they should retract it because there are just so many flaws, and there are potential or alleged frauds going on, and potential and alleged errors that were hidden and covered up. So our goal with this petition, which can be found at guypowell.com/petition, is to get as many people as we can to sign that, so that we can then, with that petition, then send a demand letter, or I mean, not an unfriendly demand letter, a friendly demand letter to say, please retract or amend that February 16th, 1989 article on the radiocarbon dating of the Shroud of Turin.
Awesome. So yeah, that's basically the clip that I wanted to share my screen with. I'll put the link to the petition for anyone, whether even if you're a Shroud skeptic, truth should matter to you. So yeah, please go ahead and sign the e-petition. But with that, I will shut up, because this show is about Bob Rucker giving his presentation on the image formation. How is the Shroud formed? And Bob has his theory. So over to you, Bob, and I'll put myself on mute.
Yes, okay. Shall I go ahead then?
Please do. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Dale, too.
Yes, a little comment here on the petition. I think a petition is a good idea. I'm not sure, maybe a little bit later would be a better time for it, and that might take place anyway. But we have to have a good reasons for it to be retracted, and so that some of the work that I'm doing now, I think will kind of flesh out some of the reasons. Some of the reasons that it ought to be retracted are not well understood, I think, by people in general. But it ought to be retracted because of the nature of the statistical analysis of the data is the reason why it should be retracted. Okay, let me go ahead then, and I'll do my presentation. Okay, so we have, let's see. Okay, so VCRB hypothesis for the Shroud of Turin. Now, this involves not only image formation, but also carbon dating as well. So this is the only hypothesis that explains more than one mystery of the Shroud. And this will explain possibly even three mysteries: the image formation, carbon dating, and possibly even why the blood is on the Shroud. So let me talk just briefly. I'm going to go. I have many slides here, so on a lot of these, I'm going to go very quickly. But my background is that I've earned a master's in nuclear engineering from the University of Michigan, then spent 38 years in the nuclear industry doing two things primarily: nuclear analysis, computer calculations for nuclear reactor design, and statistical analysis of measurement data. And those are the two items that I have used in my study of the Shroud of Turin. So I've been studying the Shroud now and promoting the Shroud for both the last 10 years. I've written 37 papers on my website, shroudresearch.net. To find those 37 papers, you'd want to go to the third page over, which is the research page. I also organized the International Conference on the Shroud of Turin in 2017. My goal is to explain the mysteries of the Shroud and to promote future testing of the Shroud. So that as we think about the tomb, on the left is a picture of what the tomb would have looked like. They would have made the opening as small as possible in order to have the rolling stone as small as possible, to make it as light as possible. So the only light would have been coming in through the doorway, so that when John and Peter ran to the tomb on the Sunday morning, John ran faster. He bent down well back from the tomb and looked through the small opening, and he saw the body cloth, which means that the body would have been on the back bench in the tomb. Now, the inside of the tomb is on the right side. This is not often shown, but you have a left bench, a right bench, and a back bench in a typical unused rolling stone tomb, according to Jewish archaeologist Lean Rittmeyer. Now, they would have put after Jesus died on the cross, they would have put the face cloth, also known as the sudarium of Oviedo, around his head in order to catch the blood then coming out of his nose and his mouth, in order to bury the blood with the body. So that when they took the body down, they would have left the face cloth on and then massaged the shoulders in order to bring the arms down to get him through the small opening. And then they would have laid his body on half of the body cloth, then the person at the front of the pit or stand-up area in the tomb. And I think that probably would have been the Apostle John. Also, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea probably would have been inside the tomb as well. But the person in the pit or stand-up area in the tomb would then have reached over, taken the face cloth off, laid it aside, and then they would have taken, as shown here, the other half of the body cloth and laid it down over the body, and then probably put ties around maybe the feet, the knees, maybe around the hands to keep the hands down, maybe around the jaw. So there would have been various tie strips as well. So that later then, when on Sunday morning, there would have been multiple types of linen cloths on the back bench, and probably the face cloth probably would have been on the right bench. So go over this just very quickly. Of course, the Shroud of Turin was discovered in the tomb by Peter and John on the Sunday morning. So it would have been taken with some other relics, probably down to Antioch prior to 70 AD, from which it then went up to Constantinople. And can you see my pointer here? Up to Constantinople. And then by an unknown route,
Yes.
Go on up to Lorraine, France, where it was shown as the burial cloth of Jesus, down to Chambéry, France, where it was in a fire, thus leaving scorch marks on the shroud, then arriving in Turin, Italy in 1578. But back to Jerusalem, what would Peter and John and the other apostles have done with the burial cloth? They wouldn't have reused it. They wouldn't have burned it. They wouldn't have left it in the tomb to be discovered by the authorities. No, they would have kept it. It had Jesus' blood on it, certainly. And it may have had the image at that point. Researchers think that the image formation probably took a little bit of time, and maybe due to ultraviolet radiation from the sun as it was being shown. So that it would still be in existence. And given church history, where would you expect to find it? Well, the answer is you'd probably expect to find it in some sense in association with the Catholic Church, based upon church history. And that is where we find it. So that in Turin, Italy, it is in this cathedral in Turin, Italy. We saw the box this last November, my wife and I, when we went to Italy. We saw the box in which the Shroud of Turin is now located. It only goes on exhibition a few times a century. Okay, so that the first picture was taken by Seconda Pia in 1898, and you can see the camera that he used. That's on exhibit in the museum there in Turin. So that the view that you have of the full cloth are two different views that are common. The top view is just the ordinary unaided eye view. If you went to look at it, this is how it would look. But the bottom view is the camera negative view. The photography enhances the contrast so that it's easiest to see things in the camera negative view, which is the bottom. Now you can also see the long scorch marks here, and here on either side of the image, due to the fire that it was in 1532. You have the front image of the head on down to the feet on the left side, and then it's a head-to-head image because the cloth came up the back, went over the head and down the front. So that you see the back of the head and down to the feet here. Now we're going to just go through very quickly. If you investigate both the front image and the back image, what you end up with deciding is that this individual was crucified exactly as the New Testament Gospels say that Jesus was crucified. So this is identical. There's no difference. So that as you look at the face here, the hair comes down, long hair, a little bit longer on one side than the other, parted in the middle, large eyes, long nose, mustache, and beard. And according to ancient tradition, the burial cloth of Jesus, which I believe is the Shroud of Turin, was placed into a niche above a wall, above a gate in a wall in the city in which it was located, possibly either Edessa or Antioch at the time, for safekeeping to avoid persecution. It was found probably in the early 500s then, and so that it was only then that the painters knew what Jesus looked like. So here again, the face, you notice, long hair coming down on either side, a little longer on one side than the other, parted in the middle, large eyes, long nose, mustache, and beard, looking exactly straight at you. And so that this image then was carried down through Byzantine iconography for hundreds of years in Constantinople. And so that our concept of what Jesus looked like today is based on the Shroud of Turin, the image of the face on the Shroud of Turin, as it came down to us through Byzantine iconography. And this same image was then started to be placed onto their coins in the Byzantine Empire about 692 to 695. This is a gold salatus that was minted under Justinian II. Now think about the significance of this. The emperor of the Byzantine Empire took his image off the coin, or put it onto the back of the coin, and put the image from the Shroud of Turin onto the coin. And this type of thing occurred for hundreds of years then, so that the image from the Shroud of Turin, the face on the Shroud of Turin, was well known and highly revered for hundreds of years in the Byzantine Empire. We also have the Hungarian Prey Codex. This is a colored line drawing, and the top of this shows the burial of Jesus. You can tell that it is Jesus based upon the nimbus. That's the technical term for the halo that's around his head. And then the bottom cloth really does show the burial cloth. There are multiple evidences of that. So that we have these and this was made 1192 to 1195. So it's both the paintings and the art and the coins and the Hungarian Prey Codex, which gives us evidence that the Shroud of Turin was well known and highly revered for many hundreds of years prior to the carbon dating of 1260 to 1390. Now let's skip forward to the scientific investigation of the Shroud of Turin. It was in the early 70s that a Professor John Jackson, who was a professor at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, discovered that the Shroud of Turin contains three-dimensional information within the two-dimensional picture that you're looking at on the Shroud of Turin. Absolutely amazing. It astonished scientists at that point and led to the Shroud of Turin research project in 1978. The scientists who were informed of this said, my goodness, how did that happen? Because three-dimensional information is not on any normal photograph or painting. It's in satellite telemetry data and on the Shroud of Turin. Just amazing. And so what we mean by that is that you can take the three-dimensional information on the Shroud of Turin and back out a statue from it. And you can't do that with any other normal painting or photograph. So this is this group of people doing the preparation for the scientific investigation. So we have something like 26 individuals were invited to Turin Italy in 1978 to have hands-on experimentation, non-destructive. They didn't want to damage it, investigation. And they worked for 24 hours a day in 3 shifts, 5 days, 120 hours altogether, so that their conclusions are the following. The image, their main objective was to determine how the images were formed. But they ran into problems because every experiment that they did said this is not how it was done. So the image is not, their conclusion, the image is not due to paint, dye, or stain. Now, why? There's no pigment, no binder, no brush strokes, no clumping of fibers or threads, no stiffening of the cloth, no cracking of the image along fold lines. Most or all of those would be should be there if it's a painting. They also found that the image is not due to any liquid because there's no capillarity soaking up of a liquid. It's not a scorch from a hot object because there's no fluorescence. Fluorescence is where you turn off, and this is what they did. They turned off all the lights. They brought up a black light emitting ultraviolet light, which our eyes don't see. But that ultraviolet light is at a higher energy range than our eyes can see. But it's absorbed on the cloth, and then that energy is re-emitted at a lower energy that our eyes can see. And that's called fluorescence. But when they turned off all the lights, brought up the black light to the Shroud of Turin, the scorches from the fire that are on the shroud, it was clear that they were fluorescing, but the image was not fluorescing. So therefore, the image is not due to a scorch. Now, be careful here. It's not due to a scorch from a hot object. I have to add that in, because I think it is a scorch, but it's a scorch due to electrical heating. We'll get to that. Okay, it's also not a photograph because any normal photograph doesn't contain three-dimensional information in the image, and also they didn't detect any light-sensitive chemicals on the cloth. So that we have various options for the image formation that we can exclude up front. It's not, very difficult to explain how this would have been done by an artist or forger because it's not due to pigment, scorch, liquid, or photography. And all attempts to duplicate the images have failed. As a matter of fact, every time they attempt any kind of a new methodology for explaining how the images were encoded onto the shroud, all they do is they prove how it was not done. Because in order to prove how it was done, it has to be correct macroscopically, large scale, just as we see it, and microscopically, as you look at it under a high-powered microscope. Did they get it right? The answer is no, they don't get it right. Now, it's also not by contact because there is discoloration on the fibers that make the image where the cloth would not have been in contact with the body. Also, for example, if the cloth was in contact with the tip of the nose, there's an image, a smooth gradation of discoloration down the nostrils, so that that would not have been in contact with the cloth if the cloth was in contact with the nose. Now, the image was also not due to random motion of molecules, that is, any diffusion process, because molecules in a diffusion process, they scatter off the air molecules in random directions, so they would automatically lose all information content. In other words, you could not form a clear, fairly good resolution image on the shroud due to any diffusion process. And it's also, and I'd like to maintain this is correct, it's also unlikely by any natural process. Now think about it. How many billion people have lived and died on the earth in the entire earth history, covered by cloth in one sense or another, either during life or in death? Yet you only find one example of an image formed by the dead body that was wrapped around the body. There's only one. Now, what that indicates to me is that this is not due to a natural process. This is due to a process that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. So, much more reasonable to say that this is not a natural process than to try and assume naturalism which is the assumption that the only explanations that are allowed are those that are consistent with our current understanding of the laws of physics. I hope that's a mistake that a lot of researchers and people in general make.
Let me ask you a quick question that relates to this. So I'm thinking, because your knowledge as a nuclear engineer, I'm thinking that this would be a good question. The atomic bomb, when it went off in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you see these images that were sort of people, and they were like stuck on walls and stuff. I'm wondering if you know anything about how that could possibly relate.
Well, it's just an example of a nuclear process leaving an image, but the process was different. On the nuclear weapons that were exploded at the end of World War II, what you had was the radiation, probably the high energy electromagnetic radiation. That'd be like light or ultraviolet light. Traveling at the speed of light would have, hit people in just wherever they were standing, and thus leaving a shadow on the concrete behind. And that's what we're seeing. So the light is coming from one side and then being absorbed by the body, where it hits the body, but not absorbed around the body. But what we have here is we have a burst of radiation coming from within the body. So that's different. Okay. And so it's not the same. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that we, okay. So let's just go over a little bit about what we know just from our experimental experiments on the Shroud that were done in 1978. What we have here is full-size images of the front and back of the man that was crucified exactly as Jesus was crucified. And there were no side images, which is significant as well. Stirp concluded the images are not due to pigment, scorched liquid, or photography. The images have a fairly good resolution in the few millimeter range. There's no images of the side of the body or top of the head. The images are negatives, that is, with light and dark reversed, and the images contain three-dimensional information. We mentioned that already. So that this is a close-up picture, 64 power magnification of the tip of the nose, where the image should be the strongest. And do you see the tip of the nose? Well, no, you don't. What you see here is fibers right in here, for example, and down in here, fibers that are discolored. And you can see that this is the coloration of a scorch. And so it's a light sepia or straw yellow color. And it only goes maybe 2 or 3 fiber layers deep. In other words, the thread is not discolored on the inside of the thread. Also, you see that the discoloration is in a mottled pattern. This discoloration is not uniform over this fabric. It just appears in some places. So that those are all characteristics that need to be explained by your image formation hypothesis. So what is required to form the images on the Shroud? Well, 3 things. You need a mechanism to discolor the fibers. And then you need energy to drive the discoloration mechanism, that is, to discolor the fibers. And then thirdly, which most people miss, but it's an absolute requirement, you need information to control the discoloration mechanism. That is, to discolor only the right fibers with the right length of discoloration. And that's part of the problem. How do you get the information there? So why do we recognize the images on the Shroud as a crucified man? When you look at this piece of cloth, why do you see a crucified man on it? Well, it's because the information that defines the form of a crucified man has been encoded into the pattern of discolored fibers on the cloth. And that photons then of light that reflect off the front and dorsal images carry this information to our eyes. Our eyes then translate that information into electrical signals, which travel up our optic nerve to our brain, which has learned to interpret that information on the electrical signals as an image of a crucified man. That's why we see it. Okay, so the key is information here. So So the first question is, where does the information have to come from? That information that defined the appearance of a crucified man was not in the air in the tomb. It wasn't in the limestone walls, ceiling, or floor of the tomb. Where was it? It was only inherent to the body itself. So that information has to be communicated from the body to the cloth and then deposited there. So how can information be communicated or transferred or carried from the body to the cloth? Well, there's various ways that information can be communicated. We can communicate using photons of electromagnetic radiation. And matter of fact, people probably don't know this, but this is how most information comes to a human body, is by being carried by reflected photons. And that's how we see the entire scene in front of us. So this is how we get most of our information input to our bodies, by reflected photons. Now, the same holds true for subatomic particles such as electrons, protons, and neutrons. Now, another means is electrons flowing in wires. Now, there weren't a billion wires connecting the body to the cloth, so that can be ruled out. There's also waves in a medium, either sound waves or maybe waves out in the ocean. Well, the problem with any kind of wave phenomenon is that it spreads out very rapidly. So if someone were behind me right now, they'd hear every word that I was saying, even though I was pointed in the forward direction. So that waves, like, for example, sound waves couldn't transport this information from the body to the cloth, because all you'd end up with be chaos on the cloth, just a blur. And same thing holds true for number 5, random diffusion of molecules. So that can be ruled out. And artist or forger, we've already ruled that out, because it's not due to paint, dye, or stain, scorch, any liquid, or photography. And so the only 2 that we have left is number 1, which the sequence that I have here is the approximate order in which these were proposed to explain the images. So the first option was, I'm sorry, that was a misstatement. I should have applied that to the next one of the next slides. Anyway, these are the 7 different options, so that for various reasons we come down to, in my thinking, we come down to number 2 is probably the right answer, subatomic particles, and I'll explain that further when we get there. So the information must control which fibers must be discolored and the length of the discoloration on each fiber. Just an amazing thing that the information must do. It must specify the appearance of the front and back of a crucified man. It must be transported from the body to the cloth where it is deposited. And it must be deposited by radiation, because we've already just excluded the other options. So when we consider the geometry, of the geometry of the body wrapped in a cloth, what we ought to recognize is that the front image is a vertical projection upward from the body, and that the dorsal image is a vertical projection downward from the body. Just a second here. Okay. I'm trying to reposition things here.
I'll just say hi, Otangelo. Good to see you here. Otangelo is in the chat.
Yes. Okay. So let me continue. I was trying to reposition this a little bit. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Here we go. So so when we consider the geometry, the front image is a vertical projection upward from the body. The dorsal image is a vertical projection downward from the body. So that means that the image formation process involved verticality. And the radiation, so therefore the radiation had to be vertically oriented to form the good resolution image on the Shroud of Turin. And there's multiple other reasons. For example, there's no side images. Why are there no side images on the cloth? Because the radiation was vertically oriented. Okay, why is the quality of the front and back image essentially the same, when the back image would have had the weight of the body on it, whereas the top image would have only had the weight of the cloth on the body? So the weight was vastly different because it was due to radiation that was vertically oriented. So we have multiple different explanations there.
Can you explain that just a little more deeply? Because I have a person in the chat, Nathaniel Robinson, and he keeps asking about the 3D data and how we know it's 3D and that kind of thing. And he's also saying something about, let me just see here. It says, I have to come and go. So wait, that's his next question. He says, okay, here it is. I'm not asking about hot objects. I'm asking about how a burst of radiation from a textured light source could produce shadows on a photosynthesis medium. Not only would this light source somehow produce shadows, but how it also is doing a two-dimensional projection when radiation goes out in all directions.
Oh, okay. What we're talking about here, as I said up front here earlier, that we're talking about an event that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. So don't assume that this radiation had to be emitted uniformly in all directions. That's a mistake. Okay? If this was a natural process, why is there only one example of this when billions of people have died or lived and died wrapped in cloth? You know, when I go to my closet and my dresser and look through all my clothing, none of my clothing has an image of my body on the inside. Okay? Why is that? Because the image that was formed on the Shroud of Turin is due to a process that is outside or beyond our current understanding of the laws of physics. Okay? Now, a little bit deeper into the weeds here. And a lot of people oppose to this because they don't like the conclusion that you come to. So that are there bones in the image? I'd say yes, there are. The images on the Shroud of Turin contain images of bones. Some of the bones near the surface of the skin appear to have been encoded into the image, such as teeth. We do see right here on the image. We see in some way the teeth are making an image on the cloth. You don't see this pattern anywhere else on the cloth, only above the teeth. And that's the point. There's also bones in the hand. There you can see. I've had a medical doctor point out bones in the backbone on the dorsal image to me, so that the radiation. The conclusion of this is that the radiation was not just emitted from the surface of the body, but it was emitted from within the body. Okay. So let's go over criteria for evaluating a hypothesis. And this is from my paper number 37. Now, again, this is when I refer to a paper number, this is on the research page on my website, www.shroudresearch.com. If a person listening to this is at their computer, it would be good for them to go there now. www.shroudresearch.com.
Isn't it .net?
.net.
I'm sorry. Yes, .com will get you there too, but .net is how we usually say it. Yes, thank you. So on a paper, I list my papers in reverse order. So the newer ones with the higher numbers are listed at the top. So paper 37 includes this criteria for evaluating a hypothesis. So, and this is, a lot of this is just normal with any hypothesis, whether it relates to the Shroud or not. So that the first criteria, and a must requirement, it must be consistent with the evidence. If a hypothesis contradicts any evidence that's known to be true, then the hypothesis cannot be true, at least as stated. And number two, it should, this is a should criteria, should make predictions that are testable and falsifiable. Unique predictions are also desirable. Now, I'll mention here that, for example, string theories predict that all of reality consists of extremely short lengths of pure energy, but they cannot find any way to test their various theories. So that's an example where it satisfies the first criteria, but not the second. Okay, now the third here, I think I would list 6 different options, kind of at the same level of importance. So this is preferred. In other words, if you have two hypotheses that equally satisfy all the evidence and equally make predictions that are testable and falsifiable, and some of which are unique, then to help you decide between the two hypotheses, you go down to this level. So the A would be 3A would be explains multiple mysteries. So I've already mentioned that my hypothesis here explains 2 or 3 mysteries of the Shroud. It's the only one that can explain more than one mystery. 3B, it's simple. This is Occam's razor. Now, the argument from simplicity, yeah, you'd like it to be simple, but you cannot exclude a hypothesis based upon this Occam's razor, because reality can be very complex. For example, the equations for quantum mechanics is a good example. In 3C, it has something called beauty. Now, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and this is kind of hard to define. But this is often applied either in science or in mathematics if the equations are similar to what they've seen before, for example. And how discovering this information gives you a feeling that you've seen beauty. So 3D is that it discusses features it does not explain. That's a nice thing to have in your write-up. And then 3E is corroborated by diverse areas of study. And so, for example, my concept for image formation, my concept for explaining the carbon dating has been explored by Professor Tom McAvoy in his studies on fluorescence. And he finds that his studies in fluorescence corroborate, support my concept of neutron absorption explaining the carbon dating. And 3F explains how information formed the images. Now, this last one, 3F, would apply to the Shroud of Turin. I think it's important. Hypotheses that try to explain the image formation should discuss how information formed the images. So, main radiation hypothesis. These are there's 4 different main hypotheses based on radiation. Now, I'm going to ignore any other non-radiation, but these are the ones that need to be considered, I think. The first and the oldest is the cloth collapse hypothesis, promoted by John Jackson and Mark Antonacci. And this hypothesis states that when the body disappeared, then the cloth collapsed through the volume where the body had been, with the body still emitting radiation, which then discolored it. So it is a radiation hypothesis. There then is the holy fire or corona discharge hypothesis, promoted by Giulio Fonte. And it was initially just a corona discharge hypothesis, and then he brought in the concept of holy fire to expand it out. And then there's the ultraviolet hypothesis, promoted by Paulo de Lazaro. It's understandable that he would go in this direction because that's where his expertise is, and that's where what the equipment that is available to him, laser equipment. And so then the fourth is the vertically collimated radiation burst hypothesis. That I call it the VCRB hypothesis, promoted by myself. And this is paper 34 on my website. Yeah, you break in and ask questions when you want to. Okay. So that
this is great. I want to say hi to everybody in the chat really quickly. We've got a lot of fun fans here. We've got a couple of skeptics in here. So just so you know, we've got a nice mix of people.
Yes. Well, I like dealing with skeptics as well. We've developed a lot of work and a lot of answers to a lot of the skeptical questions. And so now what I did on my paper 34, the name, the title of this paper is Hypothesis for Image Formation on the Shroud of Turin. And so let me back up here. When we're looking at these 4 different hypotheses for radiation, using radiation, the first 3 I would call top-down hypotheses. That is, they came up with a concept for discoloring the fibers, or they were just using equipment that they had in the lab that was kind of obvious to try something along those lines. So they started with a concept for how the fibers were discolored, and then they had to sort down through the evidence to see how this hypothesis explained the evidence. Now, I thought, I really don't even like that approach to it. I think a bottom-up approach is the right way to do it. So where you start with the evidence, without preconceptions as much as possible. You should have neutral presuppositions as far as possible. Maybe or maybe not this is true. In other words, that's a neutral presupposition.
Can I just ask a quick question? Because this is something I heard from a few Shroud skeptics and stuff, but it may be appropriate here. One of the features, and I didn't see it in your presentation yet, but whatever the radiation, when it formed the images, it attenuated, so it only went 4 centimeters and then it stopped. Images were not formed beyond the 4 centimeter mark. Now, some skeptics have said that based on the position of the cloth, if it was around the body, there would be some areas, such as around the wrists, or maybe one of the legs looks thinner than the other. Are the radiation hypotheses consistent with explaining why the images only formed over 4 centimeters, or would there be areas that were beyond 4 centimeters away from the body?
Only my hypothesis is consistent with that evidence. All the others are not. So that the people who say that are thinking in terms of radiation damage causing the image. And I'm not saying that. I'm saying, and I realize that, it's not radiation damage because then the fibers would be discolored through their entire thickness, their entire radius would be discolored. And that's not the case. So that would, you have to follow the evidence where it leads. Okay.
Yeah.
And so the image was not formed by radiation damage. It was formed by deposition of the electrical charge on the cloth. Vast difference between the two. So that's what I'm saying. And that's why that contradiction doesn't apply to what I'm saying. Okay.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Let me just build on that for a second, because I think it might also relate to what Otangelo was asking. He was just saying about how one of the hands appears a little bit longer than the other hand, and he was wondering about that.
Well, I don't get into much detail. We don't know a lot of the details. One hand was over the other. One hand could have had the fingers pointed downward a bit, so that it appeared in this vertically collimated radiation that was going through these items, so it would appear shorter. Okay, no problem. There's a lot we don't understand about how crucifixion took place and exactly what the body went through. We're not even sure exactly how he died. There's various speculations, I would say.
Yeah, I think just to build on what you're saying, it's kind of awful what Jesus went through. And you can see even in the Shroud of Turin, all the evidence of just the massive beating that he took.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Oh, okay. So when I started my paper 34, Hypothesis for Image Formation on the Shroud of Turin, I wanted to take a bottom-up approach. That is, you start with the evidence and you try and recognize your presuppositions and make sure that they are neutral in all your presuppositions, so that you're not presuming that the images were formed by our current understanding of the laws of physics. I'm ruling that out. That's not a neutral presupposition. Okay. So in other words, I took 27 different evidences from the image, and I can't talk through all of these. I already explain the most important ones. I'll just maybe talk one here. Just the number 5 is bolded. The images are formed by discolored fibers. That's important. What is it that's forming the images? Well, it's the discoloration of the fibers in the threads. Just the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers in the threads are discolored. There's about 100 or so fibers in a typical thread, but only the top 2 or 3 layers of fibers are discolored, and only toward the body. Possibly some toward in the opposite direction as well, but primarily toward the body. Now, I'm trying to be careful as to how I'm saying things. So that as we continue here and look at numbers 8 through 16, let me talk about number 16. Fiber discoloration is less than 0.2 micrometers thick around the outer circumference of the fiber. This is absolutely amazing, and the most difficult thing for any image formation hypothesis to explain is this evidence right here, because a fiber, we're talking about fibers from the flax plant that have been separated by soaking in water and then woven into linen thread. Okay, so that a typical flax fiber is about, let's say, 15 micrometers or microns in diameter. That's about 1/5 the diameter of a human hair. Okay, got the idea? That's
Wow.
15 micrometers. Yet the discoloration is less than 0.2 micrometers out of a 15 micrometer diameter. So it's extremely thin. It's thinner than the wavelength of light.
And
If you can imagine this.
Just to clarify for the audience, what you're talking about here is referred to as the body image superficiality. And number 16, you're specifically talking about on the fiber level. It's only on that primary surface of the primary cell wall. And number 12 is also related. That's the thread level superficiality, where it's only on the top 2 to 3. But I just wanted to clarify that that's what you're talking about for the audience.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Those are the two aspects of superficiality of the image regarding the threads and regarding the fibers. Okay, so continuing here, number 17 through 23. Number 21, the fiber discoloration. What is it exactly? If you were able to get into that discoloration layer that's less than 0.2 micrometers thick, what is it that's causing the discoloration? Well, the fiber's discoloration in that extremely thin layer is due to single electron bonds being changed to double electron bonds. So in other words, a carbon atom has 6 protons in the nucleus, so it has 6 electrons circling the nucleus. 2 of those electrons are in the inner orbit, 4 of them are in the outer orbit, so that those 4 outer orbit electrons usually will connect to 4 other atoms surrounding that carbon atom, so that if you hit it with an energy source like electromagnetic radiation, light, ultraviolet light, visible light, whatever, that carbon atom will vibrate in a certain way based upon how it's connected to the rest of the molecule. But if you then go through and in some way change those single electron bonds to 4 different surrounding atoms, if you change 2 of those bonds from single electron bonds to 1 double electron bond, and 2 single electron bonds, you're then connected to 3 atoms, which then the atom, when hit with a burst of energy, will vibrate differently so that it gives off light differently, so we see it discolored. That's what's going on. So that, in other words, the discolorations are not due to any material being added to the cloth. It's due to a rearrangement of the atoms in the molecules. Let's go on. Okay, number 26, there are images of the flowers were encoded on the side of the cloth that was facing the body. How is it that images of the flowers were formed as well? How did that happen? Not only the body, but also flowers. And I think there's questions as to whether they are there. Some people maybe see more than what is there, but I think there is some evidence that, there were flowers there. So that what I mentioned here, I think was number 16, on the fiber superficiality. I draw a fiber here expanded out so that on the inside it's not discolored, but on the outside it's discolored with a scorch to a light sepia or straw yellow coloration. This thickness being all the way around the circumference, and that's an important feature that has to be explained. So that this is not due to radiation simply coming through the fiber, because then it would discolor the entire diameter of the fiber, and that's not what we have. So you have to follow the evidence where it leads. Okay, so remember, this fiber is 1/5 the diameter of a human hair. So that if you were given a flax fiber with this diameter and told your job was to produce a discoloration that's thinner than a wavelength of light all the way around the circumference, how would you do it? Okay. That's what you need to find the mechanism by which the images were formed. That's what you have to solve. So I thought on this for many weeks, and then it occurred to me that in my first year of physics at the University of Michigan, they talked about the skin effect of an alternating current. Now that's a phrase that you can look up on Wikipedia. Skin effect of an alternating current. Now we're not talking about human skin. We're talking about the surface of a conducting wire. That's called the skin of the wire. Skin effect of an alternating current. In other words, what's going on with an alternating current? Now there's two types of currents. A direct current, the electrons are flowing in one direction, but in an alternating current, the electrons are going back and forth. And what that does is it creates alternating and oscillating electric and magnetic fields, which force the electrons to the outer radius of the conductor, exactly where it's discolored. Now, if the higher the frequency of the alternating current, the further the electrons will be forced to the outer radius. So that with this degree of discoloration, I should be able to determine what the frequency of the alternating current was, for example, if I knew other parameters of flax fibers. So that it was my assumption that is what is causing the discoloration on the fibers. Now, that's a robust explanation because we have experience with this. I was talking with an electrical engineer about this very issue, and he said, well, I deal with a skin effect of an alternating current every day because he's a power in power systems in electronics. So this is very common in the engineering field. Okay.
Bob, I just have a quick follow-up question, if you don't mind, about this, because so I noticed that you're thinking that the coloration of the shroud fiber, individual fibers, it is in the 360 degrees. Now I know some pro shroud experts like John Jackson, they're a little bit skeptical of that. So we're kind of in a I don't know claim, but I'm just curious if we did study the shroud again, and let's say we falsified that the coloration is in 360 degrees, would that falsify your hypothesis? Or
well, certainly to a degree it would, yes, because what we'd have to rethink this and maybe rephrase things and just think through the evidence. If you get new evidence in, you have to follow the evidence where it leads. So if there's new evidence, you have to follow it. This is very hard for a researcher to admit that they're wrong. Okay, typically. I was taught in my class at University of Michigan in the science of history that usually when dramatically new hypotheses are formulated, they're not accepted until the proponents of the previous hypothesis die, which is unfortunate, but it's just an aspect of human thinking. And you can understand it because the previous researchers have dedicated their life to explaining things based upon certain understandings, and they've written papers, many papers, they've received funding, and so they'd have to admit that to a large extent, the work of their lifetime has been disproven. And that's a very difficult thing to do.
Gotcha. So it wouldn't be like an absolute falsification. You would just need to tweak your theory.
We'd have to rethink it so that there would probably be multiple causes and not just a single cause, as I'm suggesting.
Gotcha.
Yes. But in further investigation of the shroud, and I hope we're allowed further testing, this would be one area that we would want to see. And that is it 360 degrees around over the entire length of the discoloration, or does this 360 degree phenomenon taper off toward the ends of the discoloration? And I think that may be the case. And if that is the case, then we'll have to rethink things and come up with basically a multiple cause explanation for this. Okay, awesome. Which I think is possible because there are electrical phenomena going on here.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes.
I've heard at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre that if you get near to where the empty tomb was, and that there's kind of an electrical phenomenon or some sort of electrical magnetism there.
I've heard that too. I don't have any comments on the holy fire phenomenon. I'm a little bit dubious about it at this point, but we'll wait and see. Okay, so discoloration of the fibers. The discoloration is less than 0.2 micrometers thick around the circumference. That's what I'm basing this on, of 15, sometimes 20 micrometer fiber diameter. Could not be caused by radiation going through the fiber since the interior is not discolored. I've covered that. This is due to an alternating current called skin effect of an alternating current. So that if you look here, this is the sequence of events that I'm suggesting. Now, I don't have time to go through all of my paper 34. Please go there and read it. On image formation, please go to paper 33 and read on carbon dating. So these two papers are the results of my 10 years of thinking on the Shroud of Turin. So if we go to the next one, this is the sequence, but you see here on the top, items above the top line cause the scorch less than 0.2 micrometers around the circumference, okay, which then causes the light sepia to straw yellow color of the fibers, which then causes the image of the crucified man. But the question is, what is before this? And that's the previous slide. So that this scorch was caused by heat deposited within this very thin region. And so what caused that? Well, electron flow in the outer circumference of the fibers. What caused that? See, so I'm going back step by step, and at each step saying, what caused that? What caused that? What caused that? That's how you follow the evidence where it leads. So what caused the electron flow in the outer circumference of the fibers? Well, an oscillating electrical and magnetic fields associated with the skin effect of an alternating current. So what caused this alternating electric and magnetic fields? Was an alternating electric current in the top fibers. What caused that? Well, it was a corona discharge between the body and the cloth, alternating between the body to the upper cloth and the body to the lower cloth. So this corona discharge was alternating between above the body and below the body. Corona discharge is like a miniature lightning bolt. You could call it a static discharge, for example. So what would have caused that? Well, protons depositing their positive charge on the cloth, alternating between the top cloth and the bottom cloth. So that's caused by the vertical collimated protons exiting the body. What causes that? Protons and neutrons emitted vertically. So where are the protons coming from? See, now, you can make this argument just for charged particles, but what charged particles are in the body? Well, primarily protons in the nucleus of the nuclei. And so those protons have to be emitted from the nuclei. Okay, so this comes into a little bit of background on nuclear energy. And so how would you get protons out of the nuclei? So they have to split. Okay, now it's interesting here. When a U-235 nucleus splits, it releases a tremendous amount of energy. But that's not the case, because if the body were converted into pure energy, then the strength of the explosion would destroy the shroud, the tomb, Jerusalem, and most of Israel. And that didn't happen. So you need to ask which isotope requires the least energy to split? And the answer is deuterium. That's heavy hydrogen. Now, if I had the proper curve here at this point, I could show you the difference, but excuse me. Deuterium, when it splits, does not give off energy. It requires energy. It's an endothermic reaction. It's not an exothermic reaction. So that if you had nuclei oscillating vertically, that you would have, and that vibration were rapidly enough, excuse me, I'm having trouble. if that oscillation were rapid enough, then you would have splitting of deuterium nuclei. That's part of this hypothesis. And how many deuterium nuclei would split? Well, it would be 0.0004% of the deuterium nuclei in the body would split. That's how many nuclei you need to split in order to release enough neutrons from the body to shift the carbon date at the sample location up in the corner of the shroud, of the sample location from 33 AD up to 1335 AD, which is the midpoint of 1260 to 1390. So I think that's part of this concept here. We're explaining both image formation and carbon dating. So what would cause that? A rapid vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body. So yes, we're talking about an event that is outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. But so is the Shroud of Turin with the image on it. It's outside of our current understanding of the laws of physics. So I'm not surprised by this. If you follow the claims of the Bible regarding Jesus' resurrection, this is entirely consistent with Jesus' resurrection, because his resurrection, go to my papers number 1 and number 2 on this. The best explanation for how Jesus' resurrection took place, where did his body go, was that his body made a transition into an alternate dimension. Okay, that's papers number 1 and number 2. You can look that up and understand that better. Go to paper 7. I've written a very short fictional story on Mr. Dotman in Lineland for you to understand what I mean by a transition into an alternate dimension.
Bob, out of curiosity, because there are other, even outside of the resurrection event specifically, Jesus, he walks through walls in his resurrected body and stuff. Do you see your hypothesis related to explaining that as well? Like, is he going into another dimension when he's doing that? Like,
okay, okay. He didn't walk through walls. He didn't go through the door, through the windows. No, he just appeared in mid-space by an act of his will. Okay, that's what we have. By an act of his will, evidently going through with his nuclei, going through a vertically oriented oscillation relative to horizontal body. I'm talking here, but that evidently this is an indication how matter can make transitions between the various dimensions. Now realize that for the last 40 years, physics has been primarily trying to develop a theory of everything to explain all the forces, all the subatomic particles, and all the experiments in modern physics. And so these are called string theories, which postulate anywhere from 10 to 26 dimensions that is our actual reality. Now, from our 5 senses, we only perceive 4 dimensions. That is 3 dimensions in space, X, Y, and Z coordinate system, and 1 dimension in time. So you should realize that our perception of 4 dimensions is only a very small subset of anywhere from 10 to 26 dimensions. So that all of the science that we've done, all the experiments that we've done in all of human history have only been done in 4 dimensions out of anywhere from 10 to 26 dimensions. So you ought not to assume that we must explain this in some way by our current understanding of the laws of physics. That's a wrong assumption.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. So we come now. So let me just state what we're saying here about the VCRB hypothesis. An extremely brief, intense burst of vertically collimated, vertically oriented radiation was emitted in the body that rapidly oscillated between vertically up and vertically down directions. This consisted of charged particles, probably protons, that caused an oscillating corona discharge from the top fibers facing the body that caused a high frequency alternating current in the fibers that deposited heat in the thin outer layer of the fibers to discolor them around the 0.2 micrometer thick circumference of the fibers to form the images. Very complex, but reality can be complex. Okay? So at this point then, we've finished that. Let's go on to carbon dating, and I'll explain to you how this concept of image formation is related to the carbon dating. It early occurred to me that you could not understand the carbon dating unless you also understand the image formation. You cannot understand the one without the other. They have to be explained together because they're related. And as it turns out, they are, and I know why, and it's because the radiation burst included protons to form the image and neutrons to shift the carbon dating. They're both the result of the same radiation burst. So they're tightly related, coupled together. So the process of carbon dating. Let's just go through what carbon dating is. 6 different aspects of this in sequence. You cut multiple samples from the object. Now, the warning here, the samples must be representative of the entirety of the object that you're dating. Number 2, you burn the samples to leave only carbon. You then, number 3, take that carbon and you measure the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio in each sample. Now, I'm saying that in the 1988 carbon dating of the Shroud, they did this correctly. They measured the correct ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in all of the samples. Okay, so we should be clear on that because the equipment was proven to be right by dating of certain control standards, which were dated fairly well in agreement with the known historical dates.
Well, just a quick follow-up question. So, and I'm sorry I keep interrupting and stuff, but I am curious. Let's say we don't grant that assumption. Let's say we do find out there was some contamination that, in part, was throwing off the results. So I know that your model, as calculated, assumes that the 12 carbon dates they got were correct values. But would that totally falsify your theory if we found out that the values weren't correct? Or could you just do a tweak and say, okay, great, I'll take into effect that there is neutron radiation plus some level of this ordinary contamination, and that together can explain why we got medieval results? Like, could you tweak your model to accommodate that, or no?
No. The problem, assuming that contamination was there, that you have 3 different laboratories in 3 different countries obtained approximately the same values, so that the amount of contamination, for example, in Joe Marino's invisible reweave concept, the amount of new fabric that has to be woven into the old fabric is about 86%. So it'd be 86% fabric from about 1520 or so, and only 14% from 33 AD. And so that would be very easy to identify and to see 86% of new fabric or any other contamination that you want to hypothesize. You can simply look at the photographs and see that there isn't 46%, 86% of material being oil from the hands or being smoke from the fires. The amount of contamination to shift it from 33 AD up to the range of 1260 to 1390 is so high, it just becomes ridiculous. Okay, and these samples were cleaned extensively through extensive and extremely aggressive cleaning processes. So you have to take that into account as well. That any contamination would have been removed in general.
So just so it wouldn't be possible to say, like, let's say it's like 15%, and that in conjunction with a neutron burst could be used to give a combined effect to make the medieval thing. That's just not possible?
I don't think so. After this aggressive cleaning process, it's incredible to me, I think, to have 15% of non-original material left in your sample. It's just incredible.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. So then the issue here then is that in carbon dating, you're not measuring the date directly. You're measuring the carbon ratio, carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. So then in number 4, you have to calculate the dates for each sample from the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. So you can have the correct ratio measured, But if the calculation is wrong, you get the wrong dates. Okay? Now, the warning here is that the equation that's used to calculate the date from the ratio assumes that this ratio is only changed due to decay of the carbon-14. If that assumption isn't right, then you can't calculate the date from the ratio. Okay? And that's what I'm saying is true. You cannot calculate the correct date from the ratio because there was new carbon-14 produced by neutron absorption on the cloth. Because when the radiation burst took place, protons were emitted to form the image, and neutrons were emitted as well because they came out of the deuterium atom that were being split. They have the same number of neutrons as protons. So you can see why this hypothesis is such a nice explanation, because it explains both completely. And so then number 5, you perform a statistical analysis of all the dates that you obtained to calculate an average, also called a mean value. And then you make any corrections to this value as needed. So that's the process of carbon dating. So that in the carbon dating, they cut the samples from the corner of the shroud. What we're showing here, there's a main shroud. Here, there's a side strip here that was evidently cut off and then sewn back on, possibly in the manufacturing process. You have a corner of the shroud where it was always held, having torn off, I think, at some point. So you're actually seeing the backing cloth here. So then the cut took place right here in 1988, so that they then cut it in half, and then they cut this in thirds to send to Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford. Then realized that this A1 piece was a little bit smaller than Z and O, so they then cut a second piece off of the other half and sent both A1 and A2 to the laboratory in Arizona. So that when these samples then arrived at the laboratories, the laboratory in Arizona took this small piece and simply put it directly into the vault, where it is to this day. They then took this piece and cut it into smaller pieces, and Zurich and Oxford cut theirs into smaller pieces. So you ended up with 12 subsamples, as we call them, 12 subsamples that were ultimately dated. So that the British Museum finally released the data, I think in 2017 or so, under legal request, and so that the data could then be fully analyzed. Let me back up. This slide is about where the data was published. So it was published in a paper called Radiocarbon Dating of the Shroud of Turin by P.E. Damon and 20 others. So there was 21 people signing it, and that was in the highly revered journal Nature, February 16th, 1989. I'll point out the conclusion here. The results provide conclusive evidence that the linen of the shroud is medieval. But one of the two peer reviewers of this paper, Professor Bray, recommended deleting this conclusion, but the editor of Nature, a vocal atheist, decided to include it. The other peer reviewer basically said, this paper is not about statistical analysis, so we won't even go there. Well, it turns out that that's the main issue, is the statistical analysis of the data. So the recommendation of Professor Bray was just ignored. Okay, he didn't like this because he didn't feel like it was actually proven by the paper. Let's go on. So this is the data that was obtained. So we have 4 values from the laboratory in Tucson, Arizona. We have 5 values from the laboratory in Zurich, Switzerland, and we have 3 values from the laboratory in Oxford, England. Now you notice, and this is true for every experimental value that you get. You have actually 2 values. You have the value itself, and you have an uncertainty. So this gives the range that you would expect this value to have. I'll just leave it at that point. So what's then done with this data in the paper that Damon and the others published? was that the average value was then calculated based on certain type of statistical analysis. They came down to a value of 1260, an average value for the 3 laboratories of 1260 plus or minus 31 years. So that's the average value for the 3 laboratories, averaging their subsample dates, which was then corrected for the changing carbon-14 concentration in the atmosphere to arrive at a range of 1260 to 1390, which they then claimed to have a 95% confidence. But that's only true if you know this value with certainty, which you don't. Okay. So what I'm saying here is that when I calculate, say all the black values are from Damon, published in Nature. And when I calculate the data, I obtain different values than the values shown in Damon. And I shouldn't. I should be able to calculate the values because they give me this data. So I calculate different values here. And when I average those 3 in red, I come up with 1277.8, which isn't all that much different than the 1260 value. But look at this, the uncertainty, 12.6 versus 31. That's a huge difference. And why is that? What is going on here? That is why this paper should be retracted.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question? Because I noticed there is a difference. At one time, some pro-shroud experts, including yourself, were thinking that there was actually 16 subsamples as opposed to 12. And I know that you've looked into that, and obviously now you're saying it is 12. So do you want to just take a couple minutes and explain like what happened there? Why was there confusion between whether it was 16 or 12 subsamples?
Yes, that happened with the Tucson laboratory. They had 4 samples. You know, they took their one sample, A1, cut it into 4 subsamples. They took each one of those and burned it back to pure carbon. Okay. They then took each of those 4 carbon pieces and split them in half. Okay. Mm-hmm. Which they then put through their equipment to get the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12. So it becomes a question, should we assume 4 or should we assume 8? Well, okay, I don't need to assume 8. Now, if you go to my paper number 11, where I give both options, but I don't need to assume 8, I can work with 4. So just to avoid that issue, I'm using 4 here.
Okay. Gotcha. Perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of details, and thank you for these questions. They do arise, and they need an answer at the time that you think of them. Okay, so now the important point here, when we look at this data, we just look at the data. Look at the red values here. Tucson came up with a value of 1303.6, plus or minus 17, whereas Oxford came up with a value of 1200.8, plus or minus 30.7. So when you take this value minus this value, what you get is a difference of about 102.8, almost 103-year difference. But when you take the uncertainties and square them, add them, then take the square root, which is how you do it, you then arrive at uncertainty on that 103 value almost of about 35. So the difference between these 2 laboratories is 103, rounding off a little bit, plus or minus 35. Well, that means there's a statistically significant difference between the results of Tucson and Oxford. So in other words, the laboratories don't agree as to what the date was. Well, why is that? Something strange is going on. So if you take this data, if you take those 3 values, and you plot them, this is what you get. Now, let me explain it. So what I'm doing here, I took the Tucson value and I put in what's called the 1 sigma standard deviation here. That would be this value, 103.6 plus or minus 17.1. And then I took the value for Zurich with the 1 standard deviation uncertainty, and then the value from Oxford. Now, you notice what the laboratory did the British Museum did in their statistical analysis. They simply took those three values, averaged them, and obtained 1260. Well, that's the black line right here, but the black line only goes through one of the data points. That's strange. Okay, and so that when I lay out a best fit line, do the mathematical analysis to get a best fit line, the best fit line, here's 35.86x, y equals 35.86x plus another value. But this gives the slope to that line. Now, let's go into this a little bit further. On the y-axis, we have the carbon date that would be obtained. Okay, that's the y-axis. The x-axis is the distance from the bottom of the cloth. Okay, and this is in centimeters, which is, there's 2.54 centimeters in an inch. So it's a fraction of an inch. So what I'm saying here is that the dates from the laboratories differ based upon the distance from the bottom of the cloth. And why is that? That has to be answered. You have to have a good answer for that. Okay, so when the statistical analysis was done, when the actual data from the British Museum was published about 2017, there were 4 different papers that came out and were published in peer-reviewed papers, and all 4 of these analyses listed here concluded that the 1260 to 1390 average date should be rejected, that is, given no credibility. And there's different ways of saying this. And those 4 papers, there's 3 different equivalent ways to say this concept. And the way they said it was that the samples were heterogeneous. Heterogeneous means essentially not similar. They were essentially different. And they shouldn't be, because they were all cut from the same cloth. They should have been homogeneous. But the statistical analysis of that data indicates that the data is heterogeneous, essentially different, rather than homogeneous. So that therefore, the samples cannot be claimed to be representative of the entire cloth. Okay? Now, that's why the paper should be withdrawn. Okay? Now, second way that you can say it, and I prefer this way myself, that systematic error was present in addition to the normal random error. Every experiment you do and get a value, there are random errors. Random errors are small. They can be a little bit positive one time, a little bit negative another time. But if you take multiple measurements, the positive error would compensate the negative error. You take an average to minimize the effect of the random errors, and you get about the right answer. But a systematic error is basically different. This can be very large and all either positive or negative, so that they can be very large. So what I'm saying here, let me go on here. The next way to say this is that something else was being measured in addition to what you wanted to measure. That is, you were measuring the true date plus the systematic error, giving you the calculated carbon date. So the true date of 33 AD plus the systematic error of about 1,300 years, okay, gives you the carbon date of about 1325 or so. Okay, so that's what you're going through, and that's the 3 different ways to say this. But the 3 different peer-reviewed journals said it with the first way. So now, what is the date? Well, so various techniques were developed specifically for measuring the date on the shroud. And so I list a time scale here. The x-axis goes from 500 BC up to 2000 AD. We have the radiocarbon date up here of 1260 to 1390. Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection was back here about 33 AD. The yellow shows the 5 different new methods with their, again, one standard deviation uncertainty on it. And what you see here is that you might say, well, we can't really be all that sure of these different methods, but you see how they correlate with one another. They don't correlate up here with the carbon date, but they correlate down here. They're all, 3 of them are within 1 standard deviation of Jesus' death, and 2 of them are just a little bit outside of the 1 standard deviation. So that these correlate very well with the time of Jesus' death. So that basically, again, along with the painting, artwork, coins, and Pray manuscript, all contradicting the carbon dating. So why is the carbon dating not the true date? How do you explain it? So there have been 6 different explanations proposed. Let's just go through these. The first one, and these are the ones that are in approximate historical sequence. What we have here is a neutron absorption produced new carbon-14. That was the first proposal, and that was actually a letter to the editor in the same edition that published the results of the carbon dating by Damon plus 20 others. But this letter to the editor said, why should we even expect this result to be correct when if the resurrection was true? I'm not sure if he went there, but that's how I think. If the claim of Jesus' resurrection is true, then that was a nuclear event. That is, the disappearance of the body had to be the disappearance of the nuclei in the body, which was a nuclear event, so that we could have had very strange phenomenon going on. And I believe I know what that was. It was it was a splitting of 0.0004% of the deuterium nuclei, releasing both protons to form the image and neutrons to shift the carbon date by creating new carbon-14. So other suggestions here. Number 2, contamination from handling, wax, talc, etc. 3, smoke or heat from the fire in 1532. Number 4, bioplastic film on the fibers. Now, all 3 of those, they were considered significantly, and they were basically rejected due to what I mentioned before, the quantity of contamination that you would have to have present, and it would be easily visible, and it would be seen on the photographs of the shroud from prior to 1988, and it would be cleaned off by the highly aggressive cleaning techniques.
Yeah,
So
I just wanted to, with that ordinary contaminant, just because obviously Shroud skeptic Hugh Ferry, I think on a show with you and on other shows, he's tried to appeal that, well, there is a difference in the cleaning procedures between the labs. Is it Ethel at Oxford didn't use something that the other labs did? I just wanted to get your take, because we're on ordinary contamination. Well, what's your kind of quick response to a Shroud skeptic like Hugh Ferry, who tries to say, yeah, but the cleaning procedures were different, and that's why one of the labs was so off. They missed something. What do you?
Well, the cleaning procedures for all 3 laboratories was extremely aggressive. There were slight differences in them. So if a person believes that that is the case, then he needs to go to the chemistry laboratory and do various carbon dating with and without the various differences in the cleaning techniques in order to prove that there is a statistically significant difference. They need to prove that. You can't just assume it. Okay, working until that is done, you have to work with what you have. And what you have is that the carbon dating dated 3 different control standards. All 3 laboratories dated these 3 different control standards using their cleaning techniques consistent with the Shroud of Turin as well. And that these various cleaning techniques didn't make a statistically significant difference on the control standards. So that's what you have to, that's all you have to work with on this.
Gotcha.
Okay?
We do have an audience question from Motangelo Grasso, which is kind of related here. So I'll just sneak that in if that's okay as well. But
Yes.
So he's saying it seems that nobody considers that radiocarbon dating has a rather high error rate, up to 25%. If the samples are contaminated, then that's a huge problem. And I wanted to get your take on that, because in 1983 there was that intercomparison test. What the heck was going on with that?
Yes, I'm not sure about that. The laboratories were evidently having problems, at that early date. They were still trying to work with things, and that probably informed them, that the further work needed to be done, probably chemistry with cleaning processes and whatnot. But as I explained before, that in just, I realized that carbon dating is, archaeologists consider carbon dating to not be the best way to date something. They would rather use pottery or coins to date something, so that they don't have a high regard for carbon dating. But so that, as I mentioned before, one of the problems with carbon dating is just the assumption that's made in the equation that's used to calculate the date from the carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio, and that a lot of the errors that are sometimes made are probably because carbon at a different carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio has been come into the sample and replaced the original carbon. Okay, so that your measurement would still be accurate, but your calculation of the date would not be correct because the assumption is not correct. So I think that's where you have a lot of the errors occurring. Okay.
Gotcha. Yep, that makes sense. And what I do notice in your list, you don't mention any of the conspiracy type theories. Things like, oh, Michael Tite switched the samples, or Russian hackers. There's no merit to those in your view, right?
I don't think so, because I worked with engineers for 40 years, 38 years in nuclear engineering, and I had some time, when I was unemployed between projects and whatnot. But it was over a 40-year period that I worked 38 years in the nuclear industry. And I know engineers. They can be extremely biased in their presuppositions. So that's where you have to go. But they in general, they do have integrity. Okay, so I would like to offer that to them. But I also know that human beings can be liars. Okay. Like the friend I was walking away from the physics laboratory at University of Michigan, and I said, my experiment I couldn't get my experiment to turn out right. So I got a C+ on my experiment write-up. And the other man said, I got an A on mine. And I said, how did you do that? He said, well, simple. I lied.
Oh, man.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I learned an important principle there. Human beings are liars. So you have to take that into account, that possibility. But in general, I think there's a better explanation that we have here. See, just the fact that they might have been liars, they were dating something else entirely. That doesn't explain all the evidence from the carbon dating. And that's what science has to do. You have to explain everything, not just the average value of 1260 to 1390. There's actually 4 different aspects of data that we have coming out of the carbon dating. And you have to explain everything, not just one thing. That's an aspect of deception when you're basing your argument just on part of the evidence.
Yeah. All right, cool. So I'm going to let you go back, but just for Iron Charioteer. So no, I was asking Bob about his opinion, because some proponents have raised the possibility that they just lied about the sample, or they committed fraud outright. And Bob is saying that he doesn't think that's the best explanation. He doesn't think they lied about the results that they got. So just to clarify that.
Yes. Well, my point here is that there were 4 different things coming out of the carbon dating. You had the average value of 1260 to 1390. You had the slope of the data, 36 years per centimeter, 91 years per inch. You have the distribution and range of the 12 different subsample values, and you have the carbon date of the face cloth, because the face cloth is related to the Shroud of Turin. So you have to be able to explain all of those items, and you don't do that with just assuming that there was a switcheroo in the back room when it wasn't being videoed.
Gotcha.
Okay?
Perfect. All right, cool. I will let you get back to your slides, because I know you got about 50. So.
Yes, Stephanie, is there a problem here? I'm probably going over the time limit here.
No, I think. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, we're all good. My husband's literally selling a truck, selling his truck downstairs, and we've never done this, so we're trying to go back and forth and figuring out with the title and stuff, and so sorry about that.
Yes. Okay. Let me continue with this slide. So the number one, neutron absorption, was the first hypothesis proposed, but it was not followed up on due to the complexity of actually following up on it until I did the nuclear analysis computer calculations on this suggestion, number one, in 2014. We've gone through and explained why numbers 2, 3, and 4 can be rejected based on the quantity of contamination required to cause the answer to shift from 33 up to 1325 AD. Now, number 5 is the invisible reweave hypothesis that newer fabric was sewn into the old fabric. Now, this is the most common explanation for the carbon dating, and we'll go into that a little bit further. Number 6, carbon monoxide at a higher carbon-14 to carbon-12 ratio. This was proposed by John Jackson and further investigated and rejected because it just doesn't seem to happen, and because no other values, carbon dates of other objects, were changed because of this problem. Okay, so that we only have 2 options remaining: neutron absorption and invisible reweave. Okay, so now I'm not sure, there's 9 different objections to the invisible reweave that I've documented in my paper number 33 on the carbon dating. This starts on page 15 of that. And let me just read quickly through some of the pro arguments for the reweave hypothesis. Often have better explanations. In visual inspection, finds no reweave even when done with high-powered microscopes by experts in fabric. Number 3, splice of a cotton to linen fibers is simply not possible. If you hold a cotton fiber with a cotton thread in one hand with 100 or more cotton fibers in it, and in your other hand you hold a linen thread with 100 or more linen fibers in it, how in the world do you connect each fiber by wrapping the one cotton fiber around one linen fiber? How in the world do you do that? Now, on the 2 videos that promote this idea, it simply shows one automatically wrapping itself around the other, but there's no mechanism to allow one fiber or to cause one fiber to wrap itself around another fiber. So when you think about this and the problems in doing this for even connecting 2 threads, and then realize that you have to connect hundreds of threads, you realize this is not credible. So number 4, it's inconsistent with the 12 subsample dates, and I'll explain that further later. Number 5, it explains, well, this is related. Number 5, it explains only 2 of the 4 results of carbon dating. You know, we have the average, the slope, the distribution, and the date for the face cloth of Jesus. You know, it explains the first 2, but I think not the last 2. Number 6, 86% of the samples should be cotton fabric, and that should be easily seen in the photographs. And that's a prediction of the invisible reweave hypothesis, and that prediction fails. And it's a major prediction. Number 7, the thread striation thickness in backlighting. In other words, if you turn off the front lighting and you only look at backlighting coming through the cloth, what you see is striations in the fibers, which are continuous across the carbon dating region. So that, according to John Jackson, that's an absolute proof that the invisible reweave is not true. Number 8, there's no historical record of this reweave. And number 9, the 16 patches that were on the Shroud up until 2002 when it was refurbished, they are easily seen, and that shows the characteristic technology that would be used in creating patches on the shroud. And yet you don't see this in the carbon dating region. So those would be my 9 objections. You can read about 3 pages on that, starting on page 15 in my paper 33. Okay. So what is the neutron absorption hypothesis that I'm talking about in my paper 33? Neutrons were included in the burst of radiation that caused the images. In other words, protons were released that caused the images by splitting of deuterium, which also released neutrons. A small fraction of these neutrons, probably 1 in a million, were absorbed in nitrogen-14 in the shroud to produce new carbon-14 atoms. So in other words, if you take a nitrogen nuclei, it has 7 protons and 7 neutrons in it. You then absorb a neutron, you then have 7 protons and 8 neutrons, 7 protons and 8 neutrons. And then what happens immediately is that nuclei is unstable. It ejects a proton immediately. So the previous 7 protons goes down to 6 protons. So it would then be surrounded by 6 electrons. That's carbon. Well, 6 protons plus 8 electrons is 14. You have carbon 14. So in this neutron absorption in nitrogen 14, you end up with new carbon 14 being produced, which is what's being measured in carbon dating. So in other words, the equation that's used to calculate the date from the carbon 14 to carbon 12 ratio is no longer valid because new carbon 14 was produced. Therefore, you cannot list any dates on a paper for the Shroud of Turin from that carbon dating. That's what I'm saying. None of them are realistic. Now, you can still make arguments based upon the carbon 14 to carbon 12 ratios that were measured, because you knew what those would be based upon backing out the carbon dates that are given. So that's a little finesse to it. But this caused the shroud to be carbon dated younger than its true age. So adding carbon 14 makes it appear to be younger. And that's an important point. And that's why if you add enough carbon 14 by neutron absorption in nitrogen 14, you can create a situation where you take a sample from the shroud and you obtain a date to the future, because there was more carbon 14. So they ended up with more carbon 14 than is present in our environment. That ratio is higher in the shroud samples than in our environment. Okay. So when I do the nuclear calculations, which I did in 2014, using the computer code that I used for about 10 or 12 years in the nuclear industry, called MCNP, stands for Monte Carlo N particle, where N stands for neutron. This code was developed by the Los Alamos National Laboratory by a team of, 12 to 15 probably individuals over multiple decades, probably 5 or 6 decades. They work on it continuously. This is the computer code where all human knowledge related to subatomic particles is held in this computer code. Periodically, I order the new version. I just ordered the latest version, and it does require me to pay for it, but the cost is tolerable. So I'm starting a new series of nuclear calculations now. But what I'm showing here is the calculations that I did in 2014, and I spent 6 months on these calculations, probably doing about 350 or so nuclear calculations, each one taking anywhere from 6 to 13 hours on my desktop computer, which was a quad-core computer. But what we see here is on the y-axis, we have the carbon date that would be produced for a sample taken anywhere along this line. Now, the x-axis is just the length along the body, and this is the length along the body on the dorsal image. So this is underneath the body that would have been laying in the tomb. And so I put a figure here of the body just to communicate that that's where the body would have been. But you notice what this curve right here is showing if you took a sample at each one of these points along the dorsal image, the back image, along the backbone of that image, that this is the date that you would obtain, the carbon date. Now, I had to normalize this curve to something. So I normalized this point, the second point, to 1260 AD. So yes, of course, that agrees with the 1260 AD that they obtained. But so that doesn't give me any credit. But you just notice that this curve here, it's quite variable, and it goes up to underneath the center of the body mass. You'd get a date, predicted date of about 8,500 AD. So the systematic error here due to production of new carbon-14 by neutron absorption in nitrogen-14 overwhelms the carbon date of the true date. So what you're actually measuring here is neutron absorption and not the true date. That's what I'm saying. But the interesting thing is that this slope right here between those 3 points is about the same as from the 3 laboratories that dated the cloth. About 36 years per centimeter, which is 91 years per inch. So that, in other words, the assumption that neutrons were emitted from the body automatically explains that slope to the experimental data. And that's fascinating. So that we then ask the question, which hypothesis explains the evidence? And so we have 2 different hypotheses that we're considering: the invisible reweave and the VCRB hypothesis. Now, there's 4 different areas in which the carbon dating of the shroud is giving you evidence. We have the average value, we have the slope, we have the distribution and range of the 12 subsample dates, and we have the date for the face cloth, which is believed to be the Sudarium of Oviedo. Now, it's in Oviedo, Spain. The Greek word that's in the Bible that's translated face cloth is Sudarium, essentially. And so that has been carbon dated 3 times to about 700 AD. So when that date came back, they said, well, obviously this is not the authentic face cloth of Jesus. But it raises a question. If this were placed on the side bench, and this is what now you don't know, you have no evidence for where it was placed in the tomb except by logical reasoning. Now, they would not have, when they took it off the body, they would not have put it on the ceiling or on the sides of the tomb or on the floor, because that's where they were standing. They would have put it on one of the benches. They would not have put it on the back bench because that's where the body was. So they would have put it on the left bench or the right bench. Most people are right-handed, so they probably would have dropped it on the right bench. Where on the right bench? Well, probably, I said, this was my prediction before I did the calculation, probably about even with the body doing the burial. So that would be about 15 to 18 inches in front of, that is, toward the rolling stone, toward the opening of the tomb, 15 to 18 inches in front of the back bench. So that I then did the calculation I had to place fabric, linen fabric, on the left and right benches. And I did the calculations. It was a series of about 6 or 8 calculations. And when I looked at the results, the result of the carbon dating at that location that I had predicted previously was 700 AD, within, plus or minus 50 years, in very good agreement with the experimental value. So again, cha-ching, this works. There's something very, very successful going on here. So that now on the invisible reweave, in comparison to the VCRB hypothesis, yes, in either case, you can explain the average date to 1260 to 1390. You can also explain the slope of 36 years. And that can be done. Well, that value automatically falls out from the computer calculations that I did. But for the invisible reweave, you have to assume that there was a slope to the new material relative to the old material that gives you that slope to the carbon date as you progress up from the bottom of the cloth. Now, what about the distribution and range of the 12 subsample dates? I believe that I can calculate those carbon dates based upon the neutron distributions that I predict along the X and Y directions in the tomb. If you consider the cloth being held horizontally, you have an X and a Y dimension to it. But I think that's probably not the case for the invisible reweave, because you just don't have that degree of flexibility, because you're only working with new material about 1520 AD and old material about 33 AD. But my calculations should be able to determine this with good evidence. So that what I come up with here on the VCRB hypothesis, as we go down the 4 different dating results, I have yes, yes, probably yes, and yes. Whereas the invisible reweave has yes, yes, probably no, and no. In other words, reweaving of the shroud does not explain the 700-year date on the face cloth. Okay, and so the summary of the VCRB hypothesis: protons form the images by producing an alternating current that squirts the outer circumference less than 0.2 micrometers thick. Neutron absorption in nitrogen-14 produce new carbon-14 to shift the carbon date forward from the true date. And a possible third item here is that the force of these particles, neutrons and protons, exiting the body may have thrust the blood off the body onto the cloth. Now, I've not thought a lot about this item, but I think it just should be considered in an option when you're considering why the blood is on the body. Now, the difficulty comes with the blood that would have dried on the body, because dried blood normally does not absorb into cloth. So, for example, the blood that ran down the arm from the wrist wounds, it dried on the arms, and there's no underlying wound. It's just on the arms. But now it's on the cloth. And why is that? I think it has to be thrust off in order to produce the characteristics that the blood shows on the shroud. So that's my conclusion, and that's the end of it.
All right, awesome. Yeah, it's thank you so much for that, Bob. And I find it interesting that your hypothesis simultaneously explains 3 aspects. Not only does it explain the body images with charged particles, namely proton radiation from the body during the resurrection, it also explains the carbon-14 data that we have of the shroud and the sudarium. And it also is consistent with Thomas McAvoy's ultraviolet findings on the body images. And it also explains the bloodstains, how they were basically thrust off the body, even in a dry state, onto the cloth type thing. So as far as I know, that's the only hypothesis that explains all of that, all 3 of those categories of evidence, right?
Yes, there's also another category of diverse consideration, and that is the biblical claim of Jesus' resurrection. So that what I've just gone through here is entirely consistent with Jesus' resurrection. That is, that Jesus' resurrection must have been a nuclear event, because you have to get something has to happen to the nuclei for the body to disappear. That has to be a nuclear event. And such a nuclear event, that is a disappearance of the body into an alternate dimension, read by paper number 2, is entirely consistent with vertical oscillation of the nuclei in the body. That's what I'm concluding here, is that that's how matter makes a transition between dimensions.
Gotcha.
Yeah. I know this strange sounds very strange to people who are not familiar with it, but this is where I end up when I follow the evidence where it leads.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great presentation. I know that you it looks like Stephanie's taking care of the truck right now, but I'm just sort of curious in terms of the blood stains. So you have your hypothesis. I mentioned to you on the last show you were on, Mark Antonacci also has another mechanism for the blood stains. Basically, they were kind of like in a transporter kind of thing, off the cloth and then transported onto the cloth in their state. What are your thoughts on that? Could that equally explain the blood stains as well?
The invisible reweave has to be considered, all aspects of the cloth collapse concept promoted by John Jackson and Mark Antonacci have to be considered in total. And there are multiple aspects of that concept that I think are, shall I say, problematic. And so when I did consider this, and I want to just a second here.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a paper on this subject. I'm trying to find. I'm looking through my research page on my website. Okay, paper 14 goes into that. The title is Potential Problems with a Cloth Collapse Hypothesis for Image Formation on the Shroud of Turin.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I would recommend going to that paper to consider that hypothesis.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting for Stephanie, can you just summarize maybe like 2 or 3 problems that you think really refute the cloth collapse notion?
Yes. For the cloth to collapse, you have to get rid of the body. The body has to disappear from within the cloth, and it has to disappear in its entirety before the cloth will collapse. So the entire body has to disappear. That is, and make its transition into an alternate dimensionality. And so, if the radiation is being released in that process, the radiation release is over before the cloth starts to collapse. The timing isn't right. Okay, that's one issue. So that the radiation, travels at near the speed of light. So it would be gone and over long before the cloth would even move beyond the dimension of the cloth. Okay, so you just wouldn't make any progress on it. And then it seems like there's a multiple different assumptions that add degrees of complexity to it, which are ad hoc assumptions that are only made in order to satisfy their assumption that their hypothesis is correct. And so that's a problem as well. And so that's where, what was it, criteria 3C comes in with simplicity, so that it's no longer simple, because you're assuming in this concept of the mechanical transparency of the body, so that the cloth can go through the body. It's any assumptions that you make in this are problematic, whether you assume that the body disappeared in a nanosecond, or whether you assume it disappeared over a day and a half. Neither option works. And that's what the paper goes into.
Gotcha. One last question, and then I'll give it to Stephanie. She's back now, so that's awesome. So she can ask any questions, and the audience too, I guess. If you guys have questions, raise them now. But I'm kind of curious, because the last time we spoke, I asked you about the notion of divine fire and Giulio Fante's hypothesis. And at that time, you said you hadn't had time to kind of read his paper. Have you, in the meantime, gone into it? At one point, you mentioned you're kind of skeptical about it, but have you looked into it more? And what have you found, if you have?
I've not looked into it anymore. my time is limited. I try and put in the time where I think the most important results can come about. And that area now is me restarting my nuclear analysis computer calculations to try and prove that I can calculate the 12 different subsample carbon dates that were obtained. And if I can do that, then that I think dramatically enhances the whole concept.
Awesome. All right, Stephanie, do you have any questions? Back to you. It's your show. So
Sorry about all that. We know what happened is my husband, we decided we were going to sell his truck. And so this whole week we've been getting it all worked on and got oil change and all that kind of stuff. And I didn't expect the person to come by this quickly. He just posted it on Facebook a couple of days ago. And so already he's had all these people wanting to buy it. And I didn't really know what to do. So I had to call my dad and just make sure I was doing everything okay. So sorry about all that. So
no worries. Did you have any questions?
I think I have to say, I'm gonna go back and listen to the part I missed at the end here, but I really have the thoroughness of your research is very impressive, and I think that just all of the good answers that you've had to the questions, and I think your theory makes a lot of sense. Your hypothesis that you've offered, and I like the fact that you're coming in from the nuclear engineer perspective because you've got a lot of knowledge that many other people don't have, and so you're uniquely qualified to speak about some of the radiation theories, and I think that's wonderful. And so I don't have a question. I just wanted to say, is there anything that you felt like you haven't been able to cover yet today?
No, I hope that what I've said is understandable and put together in a logical sequence. And that it communicates that I'm merely trying to solve the mysteries of the cloth with neutral presuppositions. So when I come to this, I say maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't, maybe Jesus Christ existed, maybe he didn't, maybe the resurrection is true, maybe it isn't. So you then it frees up your mind to follow the evidence where it leads.
Yeah, that's so true. In one of the things I teach an EDBA, an executive doctoral class on research methods, and the very first thing we talk about is check your assumptions.
Yes.
So
exactly
what are
right.
your assumptions? Because if you're building hypotheses, one of the reasons I do that, just to quickly mention, is because I notice a lot of people who study the Old Testament and the New Testament have the assumption that prophecies can't happen. And so they try to date the books that are written that contain prophecies to after the prophecy, like they date the book of Daniel to the 2nd century BC, because their assumption is that Daniel could have not possibly known about Antiochus Epiphanes. And I could go on and on about all these examples, but I just say, check your assumptions. And so we can see that working out here, going into the Shroud and saying, oh, it has to be naturalistic explanation. We have to be able to look at our laws of physics today and explain it, is an assumption.
Yes, it's an assumption that's not really rational, because our 5 senses only inform us about 4 dimensions that exist out of anywhere from 10 to 26 dimensions. So there's a great amount of room in the extra dimensionality of reality for God to exist, for Satan to exist, for demons and angels to exist, and for various laws of physics, so that even the resurrection of Jesus doesn't have to be a miracle in the sense of it violating the laws of physics. It can simply be an aspect of the extra dimensional laws of reality overriding our understanding of the laws of physics. Just like when an airplane is flying, you don't say, oh, that airplane is violating the law of gravity. No, you know that the upward force on the wings due to aerodynamic lift is creating a force that's greater than the force of gravity on the airplane. So it's not violating the law of gravity, it's simply overriding the law of gravity.
Yeah, exactly. That's wonderful. So anyway, let me just maybe conclude with what you all, both of you, Dale and Bob, are working on now. What's the next project you've got coming up?
Okay, well, what I've said, I'm trying to get my MCNP calculations going again, which is a little bit difficult because I haven't done any for the last 10 years. But I still remember enough of them, and I can follow them, and I have various notes to it. But the latest edition of MCNP is 6.3. The previous calculations in 2014 were using 6.1, but the input instructions are 1,000 pages long. on this computer code. And so that's what I'm trying to work with. But I'm not involved in all of the options either. The model that I'm using is fairly simple. So it's doable. So that's what I'm working on, and trying to keep up with the Shroud Science Group and what's being said there, and occasionally to do presentations such as this.
That's
Awesome.
great.
Awesome. Yeah. On my end, so obviously I'm trying to help. I was helping Guy Powell out with his petition, and apparently the link didn't work that I gave out earlier. So if you want to try again, there's another link. Just go to guypowell.com/petition, and you should be able to do that. I've put that in the private chat, so SJ can post it up if she wants to from there. Outside of that, on Real Seekers, so believe it or not, my next show will be Shroud related again. I'm going on to the backstory on the Shroud of Turin podcast to speak about the relationship between science and philosophy in studying the Shroud, because that's my expertise. I'm a philosopher by education. So I think that philosophy is just as, if not even more important in understanding and using the scientific evidence to conclude that the Shroud images are miraculous. So yeah, that's what I'll be talking about next. And yeah, I think that covers everything I was supposed to say. So yeah, thank you so much, SJ. I know this was a longer show, but thanks. It was really important to get in here.
I'm looking forward to going back and listening to the part I missed. So I want to say thank you to you two for coming on. It's been wonderful to have you on my channel. And I apologize for having to run away for a second there, but I also want to say I was trying to make videos every Wednesday at 4:30 and Saturday at 11:30 in the morning. Here's my Saturday commitment is right now, but I found out that I'm going to go back into administration full time. And so I will not be able to make my Wednesday videos. So I'm going to try to find a new day of the week that I don't have to worry about being at work at the same time. And I think it might be Sunday at 4:30 possibly. So I will keep you all posted. So thank you guys. Please like and subscribe if you like this kind of content. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Thank you.
Very good.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. Thank you, everybody, for coming in here. Great to see all of you.
One last thing.